Thank you. This crowd means so much to me. The fact that I'm here at Parnassus, one of the best bookstores in the world, means so much to me. The fact that two of Perry Wallace's sisters are here is incredible honor. This is such a welcoming city, and I feel that right now. And the only bittersweet part of that for me is the person who really deserves this type of reception is Perry Wallace. And Perry Wallace was run out of town in 1970, and Nashville was a very different place then than it is now. And I think this is the type of place that he would like to be again, in large part thanks to our mayor, Karl Dean, who makes such a who values diversity and inclusion, and making everyone a part of this community and have a chance to contribute to it. And that's exactly the thing that Perry Wallace would be doing if he were back in Nashville. And I'm excited that he will be here the first week of December for an event at the Downtown Library where Parnassus will be selling the books at 6 p.m. But thank you, Mayor Dean, for what you do for Nashville.
Thank you. And, well, first, you're a Vanderbilt grad, so tell us who Perry Wallace is and why you wrote this book.
Okay. Well, the first time I heard Perry Wallace's name was when I was a student at Vanderbilt in 1989. I read a magazine article about his experience as the first African-American basketball player in the SEC. And the article began with a scene at Mississippi State when he was a freshman. And back then, freshmen did not play on the varsity. There was a freshman basketball team. He was actually recruited along with another African-American player from Detroit named Godfrey Dillard. And this was their first trip to the real deep South. It was the first time any African Americans had ever played a game in the state of Mississippi. And the scene in the article talked about these two young, strong basketball players holding hands in the locker room at halftime of that game to gain the strength to go back on the court for the second half. And that's how just sort of brutal the racism was that they encountered in Starkville, in the hotel, in the town, during the first half of the game. And that scene just really stuck with me. I was at Vanderbilt on a sports writing scholarship, was a history major, so finding something about the school that I had come up from Texas, I didn't know anything about Vanderbilt, I didn't grow up here. And so I really latched onto this story that brought together two of my favorite things in terms of sports and history. And so I wrote 2 term papers about Perry for a Black history class I was taking. And also, I was sports editor of the school paper and wrote some columns about Perry, sort of reintroducing him to a new generation of students. That was 25 years ago. And then 8 years ago, I was standing in the kitchen at my future in-laws' house, telling my Doug and Kathy that I wanted to write a book and didn't know what I wanted to write about. And my father-in-law knew that I had this background with Perry, and he said, "What about Perry Wallace?" And I said, "Of course. Why didn't I think about that?" So. The last 8 years I spent researching and writing this book, and then here we are today launching it.
Great. Well, tell us, where did Perry Wallace grow up? And
yeah, he grew up here in Nashville, North Nashville. Short 26th was the street that he came home to from Meharry Hospital. And his sisters can vouch for this, but just the best little kid. Jessie told me that one day she went to pick him up from kindergarten, and the teacher had left the classroom, and all the kids in the room were going crazy, bouncing off the walls, getting in all sorts of trouble, except for one little kid, and it was her brother Perry, who was still sitting at his desk doing his work like he was supposed to, even though the teacher wasn't there. And she said that was the first time she really realized the character that Perry had, and that he would always do the right thing, and that would serve him well in the trials and tribulations he would go through later in his life. He went to Pearl High School. He said the proudest day of his life was when he got to walk through those doors at Pearl and become a Pearl student like his older brothers and sisters. Was a star basketball player, but also a star student. He was the valedictorian of the class of 1966 and a member of the state championship team, undefeated state championship team.
Yeah, talk a little bit about, I think one of the most interesting things in the book is the story about the Pearl Father Ryan basketball game and what that meant in Nashville when it first happened, and who won, and just talk about that.
Absolutely. So, and there's a poster over here. They're going to play a reunion of this game 50 years later, but it was 1965. That was the first integrated or a game between a predominantly white school and an all-black school in Nashville history. It was played at Municipal Auditorium. a great Father Ryan team against a great Pearl team. Father Ryan's best player was an African-American kid that all the Pearl players and students knew very well, Willie Brown. And so this game was very controversial at the time. People didn't know how the fans were going to react or what might happen on the court. It turned out to be just a great basketball game. There were no incidents of any kind. It was a close game throughout, and Willie Brown, the star player from Father Ryan, took what could have been the game-winning shot. Bounced off the rim. A kid that hadn't gotten a rebound or shot all game caught it for Father Ryan and made the game-winning basket. And walking off the court, Perry, Walter Fisher, and Hound McClain, who went on to a great NBA career, said, "We're never going to lose another game." They didn't know that if they would ever get a chance to play against a white school again and sort of prove themselves. They went on to lose their very next game, or one of their next games. But won the state tournament. Back then was still segregated. They won the sort of the black state tournament that year, and then the following year they went undefeated in 1966. Won a historic state championship game at Memorial Gym at Vanderbilt against Memphis Treadwell, and that was sort of the crowning moment of Perry's high school career.
And you write in the book about how the Pearl team would come out before the game and keep dunking the ball and sort of practice while the other team was watching and totally psych them out.
Absolutely. Every single player on the Pearl team could dunk. From Perry, who was the best dunker on the team, had been taught by David Lattin, who was the star at Texas Western on the team that beat Kentucky in the famous Glory Road game. He actually started at TSU, and Perry would play with the TSU players when he was just a little kid. Yes, but every player could dunk. You know, some coaches would discourage their players from dunking in warm-ups. Coach Ridley at Pearl encouraged his players to dunk to intimidate the other team, and they would actually come out at halftime of the JV game, the varsity players would, and dunk. And one of the Father Ryan players said he was a little bit confused, and he said, "If this is the JV Pearl team, we're in big trouble when the varsity comes out."
So he was an exceptional dunker and also a great rebounder, and did very well in school and was highly recruited for college. How did the Vanderbilt evolve out of that? Okay,
so Perry's whole life, his goal was to get out of the South and get out of segregation. We saw basketball as a way to do that. He was recruited by Big Ten schools, by UCLA, John Wooden out there, and initially was. That's what he wanted to do. He went to Iowa, Northwestern, Michigan, Wisconsin. But what he said to me was he realized he wasn't going to trade one plantation for another. And what he meant by that was when he went to those schools, he saw that the athletes were not encouraged to go to class, were basically just being used for their athletic ability. And when he came to Vanderbilt, which had not been high on his list, it had only been 2 years earlier that black students were admitted to the school. He was impressed by Coach Skinner, who seemed to be a plain-spoken, honest man, and he was impressed that the student athletes at Vanderbilt were going to class, and there was a good engineering department there, and what he wanted to be was an engineer. And so it ultimately came down to Purdue and to Vanderbilt, two good engineering schools that played big-time college basketball. We went for a drive around Nashville one day, and he showed me the houses that he had grown up in, the schools he had gone to, and we pulled over by the baseball fields behind the Luby Library over by Metro Center. And he said, "Pull over here, Andrew, let me show you something." We got out of the car, and he said, "Do you see those rocks and trees over there? That's where I did my final meditation to make the decision to go to Vanderbilt." And it was just so cool that this rock still exists where Perry made this historic decision. He then drove to Memphis and told his sister Jessie about his decision. I don't think she was too happy about it at the time. And then, the very next day he was in Memorial Gym with Coach Skinner, shaking his hand, a picture in the paper. It's in the book.
Right. And how Vanderbilt then, when did the undergraduate school itself integrate?
64.
64. And so this year, at 66 we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And in the SEC, there were no African Americans playing basketball.
Basketball. So I have to be... When I first started the book, I actually thought Perry Wallace was the first black athlete in the SEC, period. And that's not the case. So I can only call him the first black basketball player in the league. And I found a baseball player at Tulane whose story has never been told. And there's a brief chapter in the book about a guy named Steve Martin. And I just ran across, when I was reading the Nashville Banner archives, a little tiny, like 1-inch squib about, said first Negro signs with Tulane. And he had been a student at a Catholic school in New Orleans who was recruited there on an academic, a Rockefeller scholarship, and played baseball at Tulane in their last semester as a member of the SEC. And when I called him, he started crying. He said, I didn't know that anyone would ever find me. And he had never been written about before. And my biggest regret in this book is that he passed away about 6 months ago, and he never got to see the book. There were 2 African-American football players at Kentucky the semester before Perry played basketball, one of whom was killed in a preseason practice under controversial circumstances. It was a drill where he never got up, was in the hospital for a month and passed away. And his friend on the team played in parts of 4 games that year before he was distraught over that incident and ended up transferring to Western Kentucky. So by the time Perry came along, Tulane was no longer in the SEC. The 2 Kentucky players weren't there anymore. So he was the only African-American athlete in the SEC, but wasn't technically the first.
And how was his adjustment to Vanderbilt? I guess the thing that struck me from the book was his loneliness and just the lack of communication, that people didn't talk about issues, and he felt very isolated. Is that?
Yeah, I think isolation was probably the overarching feeling that he had, and he ended up talking about that to Frank Sutherland of the Tennessean after he graduated. But I mean, from his very first weeks on campus, one of the first things he did, going to church was a very important part of the Wallace family. When he was recruited to Vanderbilt, Clyde Lee, who had been the star player before he arrived, they were both Church of Christ, Clyde in the white Church of Christ, Perry in the African American, and he said, this is the church you need to go to. And it was the University Church of Christ, which was located where the old IHOP used to be, across from the Vanderbilt campus where that weird intersection is. And it was a completely white church. Perry was the only black person going. He went 3 or 4 weeks, sat in the back of the church. Some people came up and said hello, but he was...
This is the saddest thing in the book, I think.
Yes. Mostly he was, just sort of ignored in the back. And then for the 4th or 5th week when he shows up, some church elders came up to him and said, come over here. And they took him to a side room. And they said, Perry, you can't come here anymore. There's some church elders who say they're going to write us out of their wills if you keep coming to the church. And in fact, you have to leave now. And so that was one of his introductions. It wasn't an official Vanderbilt church. It was called University Church of Christ. It was across the street. His best friend, Walter Murray, who he had gone to high school with, brilliant student, his first day of English class, he walks in and the professor says, so they've let the N words in after all, I see. So that was the kind of introduction that these students were getting. They were all, like Perry, valedictorians, salutatorians of their classes, just brilliant people who weren't seen as the individuals that they were.
And how did the basketball, talk about, that you mentioned in your introductory remarks, talk about the first trip to Mississippi State and what that was like? Yeah,
I have a chapter about that. Perry and Godfrey Dillard both described Starkville as hell on earth for them. So the chapter is called Inferno. And that's the scene that I described in the magazine article where they're sitting there at halftime holding hands. Perry and Godfrey were very different people. Perry's experience growing up in the South, he believed, that he would do whatever it took to avoid setting off some sort of incident that you didn't know how it was going to go. Godfrey had come down from Detroit. His whole reason for coming to Nashville was to get involved in civil rights. And he said, I'm down here in Starkville. This is what it's all about. He was waving to the crowd as he was shooting free throws, taunting the guy that was guarding him. And Perry's like, what are you doing, Godfrey? But that was the worst part about that experience in talking to Perry and the sisters was their mother was very sick with cancer at the time. And back at that time, in the SEC, obviously still mostly a football conference, Mississippi State was hardly a basketball school at all. So there weren't that many fans there to begin with, which made it worse because you could hear everything they were saying. And you also could hear everything they were saying over the radio. And Perry's mom was in the hospital here in Nashville, laying on a bed in the hospital, listening to the game on the radio, and she could hear every word in the book being directed at her son.
And then the Ole Miss game was. Tell us about that one.
Yeah, so the Ole Miss game was the next year when Perry was on the varsity team. By this time, Godfrey Dillard had transferred, so Perry was essentially alone. In that game, first of all, Perry called any road trip, he said he approached them with the deepest sense of dread. And this game in Oxford sort of illustrates that the most stark way. It was in the first half. He's struck in the face by an Ole Miss player. He thinks intentionally. His teammates think it was intentional. The referees don't call a foul, don't even call a stop to the game as Perry is bleeding on the court. He's hit in the eye. He can't see. So the game is not stopped until the ball rolls out of bounds the next time. A team manager comes out and a trainer, and they walk Perry off the court. And the team manager was from Mississippi. He went to high school in Jackson. He was really hoping that things would go well for Perry that day, and they had obviously not. And so they're walking off the court to the locker room so Perry could be treated. And he says, "I am so sorry, Perry." And Paul Wilson is the name of the manager, and he said that he's never been so embarrassed and mad and was just literally shaking over the embarrassment he felt for his state at that time. So they go to the locker room. Perry is treated briefly, and then the rest of the team runs back on the court for the second half, and they leave Perry alone in the locker room. And this kind of illustrates the relationship he had with most of his teammates who never did anything. They weren't mean to Perry. None of them, transferred. When Jackie Robinson came to the Dodgers, there were players who started a petition, so that he would not be on the team, or they demanded trades. Nothing like that ever happened. But no one really went out of their way to be overly helpful to Perry either, and just didn't seem to get it. So he's left in the locker room alone. And he said as he's walking back through the tunnel to the court, he can hear all the fans yelling, I don't know what words to use, but they're the worst words. Where is he? Is he not coming back? And he said that what would have been an ordinary walk back to the bench for another player was a long, hellish trauma for him. And as he walks back out on the court, all of this stuff starts coming his way again. But just like you might imagine in a movie where he overcomes something like that, he played the game of his life in the second half and completely dominated. Vanderbilt ended up killing Mississippi in that game. He got every rebound. I think he scored the most points he had scored all year in that game. In a way, that's a happy ending, but as his teammates said and as Perry said, it shouldn't require that type of motivation to go out there and play a great game.
You do a great job of putting in context that, this is literally 4 to 5 years after the University of Mississippi integrated essentially under National Guard,
right,
making that happen. So it was a whole different deal. And you think about him being there alone, frightening.
Yeah, completely. And I try to do that. There might be a lot of people in here who aren't necessarily sports fans, and it's not just a basketball book. So I made a big effort to put Perry's experience in the context of what was happening in civil rights in his early childhood and at that time too. He said that he would imagine when going off on these trips, what's the worst thing that can happen? And in his mind, the worst thing that could happen would be getting shot and killed on the court or around town before the game. What he said was, as a pioneer, you just don't know. That might not sound like a realistic possibility now, but he said it was then, and you just don't know what's going to happen when you're the first.
One of the basketball things, he was famous for dunking. He could jump. He had a great ability to jump, and which is a wonderful rebounder. And while he's at Vanderbilt, they outlaw dunking.
Absolutely. So that was obviously a sort of a racially motivated decision by the NCAA. But when Perry was a high school player, that's what he was known for. He's one of the best dunkers in the country. He came along around the same time as Lou Alcindor, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was a star player at UCLA. In the Texas Western Kentucky game I mentioned, David Lattin, I think it was the first basket of the game, dunks over Pat Riley, who everyone knows, and the ball bounces off his head and Adolph Rupp goes crazy. The very next year in a freshman game at Kentucky, Perry dunks over Dan Issel, bounces off his head, and Adolph Rupp goes crazy. So most people attribute the banning of the dunk to Lou Alcindor out at UCLA, but the case I make in the book is that Perry Wallace probably had as much to do with it as anyone, because Adolph Rupp, who was basically running college basketball at the time, wasn't going to have to play against UCLA, but he was going to have to play against Perry Wallace and Vanderbilt twice a year. So over the off season, as Perry's about to join the varsity for the first time, the NCAA bans the dunk. And Perry says, that sort of stands out like a sore thumb.
And then, well, in his last game, his last shot, he dunks.
He dunks.
Which is a great. But he plays on some really good Vanderbilt teams who are preseason ranked very high nationally. Senior year, he's a team captain. You mentioned at the very beginning that he had to leave town. Talk about his interview that was in the Tennessean, that I guess the day when he was graduating or around that time.
That's right. So over the course of Perry's senior year, things are starting to change on campus where people are being nicer to him, essentially. He is voted the most popular student on campus, which is called Bachelor of Ugliness at the time. He's the team captain. He's getting the sense that people are ready to wrap up this story. We've done our thing. We integrated. He's been a good basketball player. It's over. What Perry knew was that it was just beginning, and that there were a lot of lessons that people needed to take from his experience. And that he said, what if Lewis and Clark had gone off on their journey and they never told anybody what they encountered out there? And that he owed it to the students that were coming behind him, whether they were basketball players or just regular students, to talk about what he had been through. And so the day after his final game, he sat down with Frank Sutherland of the Tennessean, who was just a reporter there then. He went on to become the editor of the paper.
He was a Vanderbilt student for
8 years.
I haven't seen Frank since I learned that. I have to mention that.
Yeah, and I make a point in the book of saying that wasn't because he was a slacker. It was the opposite. He was putting himself through school by working at the Tennessean full time. So that's why it took him 8 years. But he lived on Love Hill on the second story of a house. Dwight Lewis, who people know from the Tennessean, lived on the first floor. And Perry spent an afternoon with Frank telling him everything he had been through, talking about the University Church of Christ incident, about the professors, just sort of, if you read it now, I mean, it's hard to read, but it's not controversial. I mean, it's just the truth, Sutherland knows he's on to something, so he hurries down to the Tennessean, writes the story that night so the Banner can't scoop him. It runs on the front page of the Tennessean the next morning. Sutherland's cat, Pie Wackett, had been crawling all over Perry during the interview, and so there's these great pictures of Perry with a cat on his shoulders and his head, on the front page of the paper. And it says, lonely 4 years for VU star. And Perry knew that in giving that interview, what he said was that he was writing his ticket out of town, and that here he had been star player, grew up in Nashville, was a star player at his high school, won the state championship, valedictorian, goes to the local college, most popular student, star basketball player. You would think kind of everybody's All-American, you're setting yourself up for a bright future in your hometown. But he knew this was his parting moment in Nashville and that people weren't ready for this truth and for this story. And it turned out that he was right. And so I interviewed John Siegenthaler and Sutherland, and they said the phones ran off the hook the next day. And people called Perry ungrateful for what Vanderbilt had done for him. This is what his thanks to Vanderbilt. They accused Frank Sutherland of twisting his words and going for headlines and selling papers. Many Vanderbilt fans called and canceled their subscription to the Tennessean the next day. And so it went on. That sort of set the tone for what I was saying at the beginning about the relationship between Perry and this city and the university for 20 years. And played his last game around the same time I was born, 1970. He wasn't invited back to campus to speak and talk about his experience for 19 years. It was 1989, the first time he was invited back. As a Vanderbilt person, the thing I'm happy about now, though, is that things have changed. And his jersey was retired. He's in the Athletic Hall of Fame. David Williams, the athletic director, said that Perry Wallace did more for Vanderbilt than we ever could have done for him, that he's a hero. And Perry has a good relationship with the school now. He said that if he was the type that put bumper stickers on his car, that it would be a Vanderbilt bumper sticker.
That's good. That's good to hear. Well, and he's had a very successful legal career as both working as a lawyer and as a law professor, and excellent book. I mean, I can't recommend enough in terms of just if you're interested in Vanderbilt basketball, Nashville, the story about Stokely Carmichael being here with the impact and the disturbances there. But the context you set, you learn a lot about our city. You learn a lot about human nature. But it's an excellent work. So thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have time for a few questions if anybody would like to ask one. Yes.
I'm very anxious to read the book because I was there at Nashville when he arrived, and I will never forget the fraternity rush, which he participated in. Head up, full up, and he knew exceedingly well that he was never going to get a bid. And yet he walked through, conversed with all the brothers, did all the stuff that every other freshman is trying to do to impress his way into the social life of the university. And it never occurred to me at that time. I was so much in admiration of the way he was handling himself. It never occurred to me that he was dying on the inside at that very moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I talked to a number of his classmates, his black classmates who had that experience. There was one woman named Eileen Carpenter who came to Vanderbilt. She said she thought that when the Civil Rights Bill was passed, she was naive enough to think that racism was over, and that things were going to be good for her at Vanderbilt. She went through Rush, wanted to be, I think, a Kappa Alpha Theta because she thought they had the nicest house, and told her aunt that that's what she planned to do. And her aunt looked at her like, she said, like her head had just fallen off, and said, they're not going to let you in. She said, oh, yes, they are. They've been really nice. And then she called the sorority, and she could tell by the way the girl stammered when she called her that her aunt was right.
Well, Andrew, thank you. And you should note that Vanderbilt is the publisher of the book.
That's right. It's Vanderbilt author, Vanderbilt publisher, Vanderbilt subject. Hence the black and gold cover.
Yes, well done. But one of the it's one last thought. The Frank Sutherland article was important, and then things start changing fast everywhere. You have this information about C.M. Newton, who was then at Alabama, and then Alabama, which was one of the places that I think Perry was a little leery about visiting. Under C.M. Newton, pretty rapidly went to putting on the court basically an African-American team.
And won 3 straight SEC championships.
And SEC championships. And then this whole idea of the loneliness, so what Perry went through, that one of the things C.M. Newton did with his players was to give them the Frank Sutherland article and say, read this, talk to me, let's talk.
Right, let's not let this happen here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, great job.
Thank you so much.